All right, let's start by understanding where we are right now and how we got here from a service management perspective. Now, if you're already familiar with service management, you'll be familiar with most of this. There's little doubt that we're in a service-oriented world today. Today's economy is dominated by services. They're really the fundamental basis for value exchange. So managing services has become critical for success. But before we chart a path forward, sometimes it's good to look back at where we've been. It reminds us of the mistakes we made and reinforces the things that worked well. Improvement happens in many different places and at many different paces. The reality of continual improvement is that it's iterative and emergent. Things are constantly being tweaked and changed, which helps drive improvement and innovation. But of course, all change comes with risk. Continuous iteration, often referred to as continuous improvement or iterative development, is a fundamental concept in various fields, including software development, project management, and business processes. It's a practical approach for managing complex tasks and projects, and the USM principles are consistent with the nature of continuous improvement. In fact, USM's principle-based approach isn't really new. It leverages lessons learned and is absolutely consistent with the nature of continual improvement. I've often referred to this as the continual improvement beast. When learning about quality and improvement, you find that there's a lot of information available, and almost all of it is based on those who came before. There's been multiple instances where one expert or another took something, improved it, and republished it as new thinking. And this sometimes creates friction between authors and confusion around who exactly is the authoritative source. And this can be frustrating since people sometimes change the terminology or use different language for similar things. The USM portal has a glossary of terms, but if you're going to be involved in continuous improvement, you need to understand the nature of the beast. Here's an old example. Walter Shewhart worked for Bell Labs and is known as the father of statistical quality control. He created what was known as the Shewhart cycle. The Shewhart cycle evolved into the Deming wheel around 1950, and then to the plan, do, check, act cycle we hear a lot about today. So even Deming spent a lot of time copying and rethinking Shewhart's ideas. And one of the things he did most was to try and simplify them in ways people could understand. And as you can see by this quote. Here's another example. In 1964, Dr. Harold Levitt, an American psychologist of management, developed a business management model called Levitt's Diamond Model. This was made up of 4 aspects: people, tasks, structure, and technology. Now, over time, Levitt's Diamond was reimagined into people, process, and technology and called the Gold Triangle. And this eventually became the Venn diagram that we see today. What's different with the nature of the beast today is the speed and ease of which improvements to proven techniques can be duplicated and often monetized by the community. Food for thought as you race along the digital turning point and its related disruption. But remember that one of the reasons some improvements last is that they're simple. And enterprise service management could use a dose of simplicity today more than ever. But let's get back to service management. If you're going to learn about service management, and especially the USM method, there are 2 concepts that need to be well understood and are often the subject of endless debate. One is process, and the other is service. A process view sharpens the understanding for the operational model of a business capability. Services make a deliberate effort to abstract the internal operations and instead focus on the overall value proposition for the customer. Now, this was articulated as a white box, black box perspective from a 2010 article by Michael Roseman, where he used a white box, black box analogy. But in any case, the distinction between services and processes can be useful in understanding the origins of service management. The 1980s were largely an era of goods-dominant logic, where value was based on the exchange of goods. Service was after the sale. This was the mainframe computing days. We really wouldn't see service-dominant logic for 2 more decades. In 1984, Richard Norman wrote a business book on service management, and it emphasized a streamlined service management system and culture as a management instrument. The 1990s ushered in client-server computing. The first version of ITIL was published in 1989 and had over 40 books. By 1996, the second version of ITIL was released and had 12 processes. The 1990s also ushered in an era of process reengineering and corporate downsizing. It was also when we adopted TQM, or Total Quality Management, which is a follow-up to Six Sigma. We had flow charts and control charts everywhere, and we would eventually create business process model notation early in the next decade. Six Sigma's define, measure, analyze, improve, and control is really an elaboration of the plan, do, check, act cycle. Another thing you might see from the TQM days is something called SIPOC, which stands for Supplier Input Process Output. SIPOC helps identify all relevant elements of an improvement project before work begins. Note that using SIPOC can be anywhere within a process. We can analyze segments of a process flow at very low detail levels or at higher levels. And you'll see this customer-supplier linkage again in the USM method with a slightly different twist. That nature of the beast thing again. This relentless focus on process was a double-edged sword. Unfortunately, rather than being seen as a means of improving organizational effectiveness and productivity, process became synonymous with corporate downsizing, which was really a PR disaster for the process movement and lasted a number of years. By the turn of the century, we were well on our way to a services orientation. You'd see books like The Customer Expectation Management Method and Jobs to be Done Theory, which we'll briefly touch on in one of our modules coming up. And the Agile Manifesto was created in 2001. But the ITIL service management guidance was still heavily IT and process oriented. In fact, the ITIL books increased the number of processes first to 28 and then eventually to 34 processes. By the next decade, rapid advances in technology and emerging practices such as DevOps significantly impacted service management. It resulted in an explosion of complexity. More practice frameworks emerged, and ITIL shifted its focus from process to practice. This is the nature of the improvement beast. Improvement is iterative and tends to occur in cycles where one day we're abstracting away complexity and simplifying processes, and the next we're decomposing and analyzing them, which tends to add complexity. And as this experimentation happens, definitions change, debates take place, and confusion often reigns. Again, the nature of the improvement beast. So now let's look at where USM was along this timeline. The vision for USM was and is to be a method for establishing a simple service management system. The USM method has been largely driven by its chief architect, Jan van Bon, who chairs the Service Foundation. There's a page on the USM portal about USM's history, which I'll summarize in this module. USM is based on systems thinking, and this didn't happen overnight. The initial implementation of process-based working, or IPW, was born from an assignment to create a control system for a large IT organization in the late 1980s. Since Jan had studied biomathematics, he applied systems theory to the assignment, and the result was IPW. This systems-based approach developed into Integrated Service Management, or ISM, in the late 1990s. But as ITIL was becoming a globally accepted practice framework for IT service management, ISM drifted towards a practice-based mindset, and one of the many frameworks that simply reduced the number of processes rather than really re-architecting them. With the release of ITIL 3, it was clear that attempts at simplifying service management were not succeeding with ISM, and the nonprofit Service Foundation was established, and USM was re-architected as an open knowledge product. The USM publication was released in 2016, translated to English in 2021, and today has been in field test for almost a decade. Today, the USM content is supported by a rapidly growing USM management group, which is made up of USM partners and USM professionals, as well as USM users. So USM is a community product supported by the nonprofit Service Foundation, but all work is performed by the community who forms the management group. So now that we have a little history, let's focus on where we are today from a service management perspective. Now, a few things are clear. First, at this point, we're all service providers. The shift from goods-dominant logic to service-dominant logic is largely complete. In fact, the focus on customer experience suggests that we're concentrating on experience-dominant logic, regardless of whether we've been successful at goods-dominant or service-dominant thinking. So a word of caution. Goods and services are still needed. In fact, they're the basis of good experiences, the stage and the props, as this quote attests. Second, change continues at an ever-increasing pace. Emerging technical developments such as AI and RPA will accelerate things even faster. This is why we hear about things like high-velocity IT. Our management system must adapt to a VUCA world. And this leads to our third point. There's an explosion of both knowledge and complexity. New practices and practice frameworks are emerging as experimentation accelerates. New technologies are being developed faster than ever, and traditional organizational structures are changing with new concepts such as radical enterprises. The world is now VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. At the same time, the enterprise seeks full control over their end-to-end services, but there's many factors that get in the way. We're connected today more than ever, so integration across the service ecosystem is critical. There are also more moving parts than ever. Each of them is part of the end-to-end service system, so if they're fragmented, the service suffers. In fact, this leads to exploding dependencies, especially with technology-based services. These challenges create a vicious cycle. We live in an age of digital disruption when the introduction of new digital capabilities and business models shift customer expectations rapidly. And this is happening on a continuous basis today. Being in full control of your services in today's world is not so easy. Just as these new elements disrupt the status quo for the business, so too must service management rethink the way services are managed. Transformation is continuous, which is driving the need for a systems thinking approach to service management. It's time to rethink service management. Let's start by thinking about USM and the practice frameworks. When most people think of services, especially non-IT people, they think of core business services that serve external customers. After all, as Drucker says, all results originate outside the enterprise. And this gets us focused on external customers in the customer journey, which span primary or core business activities. But we know that IT doesn't deliver core business services on their own. There are lots of other facilitating disciplines that are needed: HR, finance, security, and many others. Practice frameworks that are suitable for IT may not be suitable for HR or finance. In fact, each facilitating discipline will want to leverage practices that are localized to their specific needs. There'll also be external service providers as a result of outsourcing. The customer journey and experience are dependent on the entire service chain or service ecosystem. Servitization means we're all service providers and part of complex service chains and networks. The enterprise service management challenge is to get all service teams to cooperate in a sustainable way. But practice-based thinking is a completely different mindset. Teams are focused on localizing practices and look at the world from their own isolated perspectives. But an enterprise service management strategy must be based on cooperation. And this requires integration, which in turn requires at least some degree of standardization. Sustainable supply chains and service ecosystems need strong links. It doesn't really matter where you are in a service supply chain. If you're a service provider, you have customers at the front end and suppliers on the back end. So whether you're an internal facility team, an integrator with your own suppliers, an external service provider, or the primary or core domain, every provider is just a link in a chain. USM is a method for establishing and maintaining a service management system. A method is a fixed, well thought out course of action that's based on principles. So a method can be learned and repeated. Frameworks are structured sets of best practices based on standards, techniques, and reference models. These are applied, or as Idle would say, adapted. A provider's routines define how the provider works. And the management system ensures that these routines are kept in control in an ever-changing world by organizing and coordinating resources. The management system is a unifying link. Looked at another way, governance creates the environment in which others can manage tasks. But without feedback from management, governance is likely to be pretty ineffective. And various practice frameworks are adapted to meet localized requirements. So as your organization evolves, so too should your management system. A unified service management method helps you do this. So before I wrap up this first section, I'd like to briefly mention a few words about organizational maturity from a USM perspective. The typical approach to measuring organizational maturity has been based on a capability dimension. In other words, the scale we use measures the degree of perfection with which we perform a certain action. And this translates to how well we perform our processes. The unified service management method uses a different scale, one based on value creation, or how much added value is provided in a customer-provider relationship. So you see the maturity levels are different. Capability maturity helps us achieve operational excellence. It's internally focused. Service level agreements started to shift our focus to outside in an attempt to achieve service excellence. But in order to achieve experience level agreement targets, you'll still need a foundation of operational and service excellence. The USM method helps you achieve each of these levels, but measures maturity from a customer excellence perspective. So for the design of service management, USM zeroes in on a customer or business level of organizational maturity. Check out the free ebook at the USM portal. Okay, to wrap up section 1, let's do a quick review. More than 2 decades of applying practice frameworks as technology changed has resulted in an explosion of complexity. Today, everyone's a service provider, and service management is everyone's business. While we need to leverage practice frameworks, we must also simplify service management for the enterprise. Unifying service management for the enterprise is going to require links for sustainable service supply chains. All right, let's move on to section 2.